What's up, guys? John the Morgile here, going to do a video response to this video from Greater Sapien. It's called 11 Questions Flat Earthers Are Afraid to Answer. Thanks to Barry S. for bringing this channel to my attention through the message board on Patreon. If you'd like to become a patron through Patreon, you can do so at www.patreon.com/themorgile. I'll go through each one of these point by point and answer the questions that we're supposedly afraid to answer. So hope you guys enjoy, and let's get right into it.
I can only take bullshit in small portions. I've noticed that the only support flat earthers have for their position comes in the form of claims against a round Earth.
I'd just like to quickly mention, before we start getting into these questions that we're afraid to answer, if we can show that the Earth doesn't have curvature, then it couldn't possibly be a sphere. And by definition, if a surface doesn't have any curvature, and of course it's lumpy, you've got mountains and valleys and rivers and all that stuff, but as a whole, the Earth is shown to be a plane because it doesn't have curvature. I don't know where else you would look other than the ground itself for large curves, especially over standing water. And if you can't find such curvature on the Earth, then it isn't a sphere. So I don't see any problem with disproving the fact or the notion that the Earth is a sphere. Because if it isn't spherical, then what is left? It is flat. So for scientism religious zealots to claim that we are, for some reason, not allowed to prove that the Earth isn't a ball, really goes to show that they are not interested in science, because the scientific method entails asking questions and trying to debunk standing theories.
If the Earth is round, why this? If the Earth is round, why that? Posing a lot of questions for others, but not answering questions for themselves. So I've come up with a few simple questions that are thoroughly understood in the current round Earth heliocentric model of the solar system and the current understanding of the standard model of physics.
And I would just quickly mention before we get started that we don't necessarily have to have answers for everything, especially not half-baked theoretical answers for everything like the globetards do. Really, our position, the only thing that we must have, and we do have in spades, is proof that the Earth doesn't have curvature, nor is it in any type of motion whatsoever. Beyond that, we don't have to explain what the stars are, what the sun is, what the wandering stars are, what the moon is, none of that stuff. All we have to do is physically measure the Earth, which means geometry, and test for geological motion, which is physics at its most basic sense. So we really don't need to explain everything. Why is it that globeheads seem to think that because they believe they have all the answers to everything, then in order to have a flat Earth, then we must have answers to everything? It's ridiculous. Mainly because, that on your side of the argument, you have anywhere from 500 years to a couple thousand years head start, and you have all of the theoretical physics in ink in every textbook ever written for hundreds and hundreds of years, and you think that that somehow supports your position. Well, it may theoretically, but you have a pretty big head start. And frankly, I think it would be foolish for us to start whipping out answers to things like what are stars made of, or what is the moon, because some of these questions, frankly, we can't answer. Sure, we could develop pseudoscientifical agencies like NASA and pretend to have answers and put them in textbooks and force our belief systems onto the toddlers of every generation for hundreds of years. But frankly, I wouldn't do that. And even if we would, this is a relatively new topic. It's only been around in the public domain in the modern sense for just a few short years, So whatever.
These aren't complex gotcha questions that require a master's thesis to explain and can be answered in a few sentences by the accepted models. But I have yet to see anything from flat Earth proponents that would answer these questions. You see, flat earthers want their model to supplant the globe model, the heliocentric model, and the standard model. In order to do that, it has to do three things.
Where do you get your information? Flat earthers want to supplant our model with the globe model and the heliocentric model. No, we're screaming at the top of our lungs from the rooftops that the Earth doesn't have curvature, it's not a sphere, it's not spinning around, it's not orbiting, and this is all demonstrable. This is kind of a big WTF moment for everybody, but for you to say that we want our model to replace everything, that's ridiculous. Sure, we need the model that's being drummed into the heads of all generations of toddlers replaced or stricken from the scientific record because it's just absolute hogwash. But we really, at the end of the day, we need to be scientific about this. We need to be asking the right questions. We need to be measuring the Earth. We need to be performing physical experiments. And at the end of the day, all of this data points conclusively, hands down, to a motionless planar Earth. Now, if you feel that we are somehow trying to replace the globe Earth model, well, you're half right. We need to strike the globe model from our educational systems, and then we'll have a starting point.
It has to have answers to all the questions that have already been answered by the current models. It has to answer them better than the current models. And it has to answer questions that the current models don't have answers for.
Wait a minute. So you're telling me that not only do we have to answer the questions that your model answers, we have to answer the questions better than your model answers them, and we have to answer questions that your model doesn't answer. That's just absolute nonsense. If we can show that the Earth has no curvature, we can show that the Earth isn't in motion, then your model has failed. It's been debunked. It's disproved. It doesn't exist. There is no spinning globe world. And for you to claim that we have to answer all of these questions, that the best your model can do is answer them with theoretical hypotheticals, is just absolute nonsense. The standards that you expect us to adhere to, when all we're doing is pointing out the obvious fact: the Earth is not a ball and it's not spinning and orbiting in space. And space, for all intents and purposes, doesn't exist as you believe that it does. There is no infinitude of galaxies out there in the sky. They're just lights in the sky. Period.
So these are questions I've never seen answered by flat earthers. Many of them have never been asked to flat earthers, as far as I know. This is a legitimate call for answers, and I would like to only see answers from those who support the flat earth concept. So don't just post back, "because magic," just to troll them. I would like to see honest answers. I will not argue your points, although others might, but if something is unclear to me, I may ask for more information. Okay? Great. Here are my questions. Where is Venus right now?
Are you being serious right now? What in the world does that have to do with the shape of the Earth? Where is Venus right now? Honestly, how is that question relevant to anything? It isn't. The shape and nature of the Earth have nothing to do with the lights in the night sky. We can come up with theories, but it's totally irrelevant. Sir, measure the Earth. Perform physical experiments to prove this motion that you believe in, and you will, without fail, come up empty-handed every time.
Back in June of 2012, I recorded the transit of Venus across the face of the sun. You can see the video here. This is 15 minutes of video sped up to 1 minute. I put eclipse filter glasses over the camera and caught it. According to the current model, Venus and Mercury have orbits within the orbit of the Earth and around the sun. So, periodically they pass between the Earth and the sun. Mercury will transit again in 2019. Where are Mercury and Venus right now?
Again, I will say that is 100% irrelevant to the shape and nature of the Earth, but I will pose a question to you, because that's what we flat earthers do, is we just evade your questions and ask other questions. But the actual answer is, where Venus is totally irrelevant to curvature or motion of the Earth. But my question to you is, have you ever seen Venus or Mercury after sunset? Because if you have, that is physically impossible in the heliocentric model. You see, just as you said, according to your model, Venus and Mercury's orbital path place them on a tighter orbit than the Earth, which means Venus and Mercury should always be on the day side of the Earth. And the fact that you caught the transit of Venus yourself, that's great. And it was during the day, so that matches your model, sort of. But again, the question is, how is it possible for you to catch a glimpse of Venus or Mercury after sunset? And, I would also quickly mention that the fact that we can see Venus with the naked eye debunks your model. Because you see, Venus, according to you, is 24 million miles away at its nearest from the Earth, and 162 million miles when it's furthest from the Earth, with a diameter of only about 7,500 miles. Optically, physically, the angular size of this thing should be too minuscule for us to see with the naked eye. But that is really secondary to the main point that Venus should never be visible after sunset. Neither should Mercury. They should strictly be on the day side of the Earth. And so this is just one example of where your model just absolutely falls apart. And it's one of the reasons why we don't have to answer all these questions, because frankly, your answers don't make any sense at all. So why are we held to a higher standard than you? Should we just make something up and put it in textbooks, and therefore we're correct, and follow suit with globe earthers? I don't think so. That's against the spirit of the flat earth community.
Why do the sun and moon rise and set the way they do? Both the sun and the moon trace paths across the sky, then disappear over the horizon, bottom edge first, then rise top edge first on the opposite horizon. They do this at different times for different viewers, and those times are in direct correlation to the longitude of the viewer on Earth. How does the flat Earth model explain this? And kind of connected to that is, why does anything vanish over the horizon?
Well, the simple answer to your question is the fact that it's totally irrelevant. If the Earth doesn't have curvature, nor is it in motion, demonstrably so, then what's happening in the heavens is 100% irrelevant. But the best guess answer, based on what we know, is that the sun and moon are relatively local bodies. They're not hundreds of thousands or millions of miles away, as you believe, but they're relatively close, relatively small objects, if they are even physical objects, and they're traveling more or less along planes of orbit, for lack of a better term. And from our viewpoint here on the ground, you have two things that cause the rising and the setting of the sun and moon. The first thing is perspective. So, objects that are higher than your line of sight, as they travel away from you, will appear to go down towards the vanishing point, down towards your line of sight. And that's the first part. The second part would be refraction, atmospheric refraction. You see, inbound light from celestial objects or celestial bodies is refracted through the atmosphere, which causes them to appear lower with lateral distance gained from the observer. So again, the two things are perspective and refraction, but frankly, this is all quite irrelevant. And one question that I would ask to you is, where is the curvature? The other question I would ask to you is, where is the motion? Because in order for your model to work, you have to prove curvature and you have to prove motion. And not just any motion, you're talking axial rotation of 1,000 miles an hour at the equator, and orbital velocities of 66,000 miles an hour just for the Earth around the Sun. Frankly, none of this motion exists, and so it is completely moot to start thinking up explanations of what the sun and moon are. It really, truly is. And you may call this a cop-out, but um, it really is quite irrelevant.
Why does daylight on Earth have the pattern that it does? The sun illuminates half of the Earth in a very specific pattern, half of the Earth. A very brightly lit area that drops off quickly, leaving an inverted area that's very dark, the other half. If we flatten the Earth out into a rectangle, it looks like this. Noting the illuminated areas and marking them out on a flat Earth model that is often used, we get light projected in a distorted shape, and less than half of the Earth is in daylight. How does the flat Earth theory explain this pattern of daylight?
Well, we can get into theory. I mean, none of this proves curvature or motion of the Earth, but it appears that the magnetic field of the Earth, coupled with the atmosphere causing light to refract and bend, this is what causes these patterns, apparently. But I would add, again, that without curvature of the Earth, it couldn't be a sphere. So you really don't have a position here, and I'm really, really waiting to hear the questions that you ask regarding the curvature of the Earth, because that really is the big one.
What holds the sun and moon in place and moves them? Very simple. If the sun and moon are smaller than the Earth and traveling in patterns above its flat surface, what keeps them from falling to the Earth and moves them in their paths?
Okay, I'm going to go with my standard answer here and state that this question is irrelevant to the shape and nature of the Earth. But let's look at your answer to this question. You're going to say it's gravity. And gravity is a theory that has never been proven and has actually been debunked, but your theory is gravity, which somehow binds the planets and the moons in orbits around the sun and around one another and holds everything together. But this force of gravity that you claim and that you believe in doesn't exist. There's no experimental evidence for it. You can point to the Cavendish experiment as your piece of evidence for this, but frankly, sir, matter does not attract other matter, unless you're talking about some sort of magnetic relationship. But you can't demonstrate large conglomerations of dense matter having an attraction to other large, dense conglomerations of matter. And so you have this theory of gravity, you have this theory of infinite space, you have this theory of globular planets and suns in this whole infinitude of vacuum. But so gravity, that's your answer. How does gravity keep the atmospheric pressure of the Earth held fast, adjacent to the infinite vacuum of space? Is gravity now attributed to being structural and tensile material, separating a vacuum from a higher pressure environment? It's absurd. Yet it's written in textbooks, and so you can point to that theory as somehow evidence, but it is not.
Why do you see the same face and phase of the moon no matter where you are on the Earth? Basic geometry. If the moon is close to the Earth, people at different locations on the Earth's surface would see a different view of the moon and see both a different face and different phases.
You honestly should have named this video 11 irrelevant questions that you believe you have answers to, but have absolutely nothing to do with the shape or nature of the Earth. Now, in short, the answer to your question is we don't know what the sun and moon are. We don't know how large they are. We don't know how far they are. But for all intents and purposes, it appears that what we're seeing as the sun and the moon are subjective instances that are decoded by our eyes and our minds. And so, more or less, it appears that we're looking at projections. And these projections are given from some source light for the sun and the moon and the stars, and they are rendered into the visual spectrum by the atmosphere or the atmos plane itself. And again, for you to just keep asking these totally irrelevant questions is just so very typical for your people with your position, but it really does get rather tiresome because I would love to see your evidence for geological curvature and geological motion. And again, has nothing to do whatsoever with the heavenly luminaries. It has everything to do with basic demonstrable physics, basic demonstrable geometry, and nothing more. We don't have to get into theoretical absurdities. Would you like to point to any experimental evidence that shows curvature of the Earth or motion of the Earth? Because neither of these things exist, and without that, you have no model.
Why does a lunar eclipse happen? How does the Earth's shadow go across the face of the moon? And if it's not the Earth's shadow, then what is it?
Frankly, this is just another one of these questions, and I suppose that you believe flat earthers are afraid to answer them, but goodness gracious, why would we waste our time answering questions about your model when you don't even have a physical basis in reality for your model? Again, if the Earth isn't a sphere, and that's provable, and if it's not in motion, which is also demonstrable, then there's no reason to start, grasping at straws to figure out how things work on your model and explain things better when we don't need a model. We're not claiming to have a model. We're simply stating clearly that the Earth isn't a ball. It's not spinning. And yeah, maybe I should stop answering these questions, but okay. So, in terms of a lunar eclipse or eclipses in general, there are major, major problems with your model, and we don't need to have answers for these because you don't have answers either, and you've got at least a 500-year head start. Now, one of the biggest problems with eclipses in general is the umbra penumbra phenomenon, where you have essentially pinpointer converging conical shadows coming from, these spherical objects in space, and unfortunately, nowhere in reality can you demonstrate shadows behaving as such. In reality, an object that obstructs a light source will cast a shadow that is divergent from the obstruction. So you'll have a conical shape that gets wider and wider away from the obstruction and away from the light source. In your theoretical absurd version of reality, you have, and you must have, shadows which converge into a point from the obstruction, which is the opposite of what we see in reality. Now, I will also mention that Eratosthenes' ancient Greek experiment that allegedly proved the circumference of the Earth by measuring the shadow angles of two different locations on the same meridian, triangulating on the sun, and getting the result. That Eratosthenes experiment relies 100% on the inbound light rays from the sun coming in at nearly perfectly parallel angles to one another. Now, unfortunately, you would like to have your cake and eat it too. You want to have the light rays coming from the sun at more or less perfectly parallel angles to one another, but also having the light rays from the sun coming in at convergent angles in order to create a convergent pinpointer stylus-like shadow, which, for example, for solar eclipses, when the moon allegedly transits the sun, causing solar eclipses, the totality of the moon's shadow is usually around 50 or 60 miles in diameter. However, there have been cases on record where the totality, the moon's shadow, was less than 2 miles in diameter. And this doesn't make any sense in your model, again, because Eratosthenes' experiment, which is still a flagship quote-unquote proof of a spherical Earth, must have the sunlight coming in at parallel lines from the sun, but you also must have the sunlight coming in at a convergent angle to create this umbra penumbra effect, which again, you cannot demonstrate this in reality. When a shadow is cast from an object obstructing a light source, that shadow is going to be equal to or greater than the cross section of the object which is obstructing the light source. Nowhere in reality can you demonstrate shadows which converge into a point. Only in your theoretical model do you see this because you must have that to make it work. But again, this contradicts the entire basis for your theory, which is Eratosthenes' experiment way back in Alexandria and Syene a couple thousand years ago. So again, I know it sounds like I'm beating a bit of a dead horse here, but we don't have to answer your silly questions. The Earth doesn't have curvature, it's not in motion, therefore it's not a spinning sphere. Other than that, maybe we need theoretical people to start looking at answers to some of these things, but first, you need to look for the answers, or others need to look for the answers. We can't do it all. And one thing that we simply refuse to do is fill in blanks or fill in unknown values with just absolute nonsense theory. We want to take a zetetic approach to this, which means to proceed with our inquiry only based on what we can prove. Now, I'll just give you another thing that's wrong with the heliocentric model, which is, this whole thing is absurd because the Earth clearly isn't a ball. But your question was, how is the Earth casting a shadow on the moon? And if it's not the Earth's shadow, then what is it? Well, in your model, the moon should technically travel through the shadow of the Earth far more frequently than the moon would apparently transit the sun, according to an observer on Earth. Now, the reason for this is because the Earth's shadow should technically be at least as wide as the Earth itself. Okay, it should. Frankly, it should diverge. The Earth's shadow should diverge from the Earth, going away from the sun. But instead, what we have is, again, this peculiar pinpointer stylus shadow of the Earth going off into space, creating a little pinpoint in space that the moon must hit dead on balls in order to get a lunar eclipse, right? But if you look at a 100-year stretch, there are roughly equivalent number of lunar and solar eclipses, which is just ridiculous in the heliocentric model because in order to have a solar eclipse, then the moon must transit the sun. And there's only one point that the moon could do this from. But on the other end of this spectrum, in terms of lunar eclipses, the Earth should be casting a wide, divergent conical shadow into space, and the moon should transit this shadow quite frequently. Certainly more frequently than solar eclipses, but again, we see roughly the same number over a 100-year period, and this is just yet another piece of evidence against your model. But again, to answer your question, if the Earth is demonstrably not a sphere, and I challenge you to produce one shred of physical evidence to show that the Earth is a sphere, then there's no point in answering your question. We don't know what causes lunar eclipses. Now, it could be something along the lines of a Faraday effect, could be something along the lines of a Rahu and Ketu heavenly body that is not within the visible spectrum that transits the moon during lunar eclipses. But again, until the Earth is shown to be spherical, then there's absolutely no point in trying to answer these questions in a flat Earth model because we frankly need to get the world on board with this scientific inquiry first, and then we'll start answering these questions later. Again, we refuse to just start pulling stuff out of our asses and writing it into textbooks, forcing it down the throats of all generations of toddlers, and then calling it fact. That is not how science is done.
How does a solar eclipse happen? All models I've seen of the flat Earth that have the sun and the moon in them put them the same size on the same plane. How does the moon pass in front of the sun and so close and not interact with it? Why does the shadow of the solar eclipse cover such a small area? The closer an object gets to a light source, the bigger the projected shadow.
Okay, so that was sort of a 3 or 4 part question, but again, all irrelevant, all having nothing to do whatsoever with the shape of the Earth, nothing to do with the motion of the Earth. You believe you have answers for this, and so you believe you're correct, but let's just go through these really quickly. How does a solar eclipse happen? Well, it appears that the moon may be transiting the sun, according to observers on Earth, although it may be something else. I believe that there's enough evidence to support the notion that the moon is transiting the sun, according to an observer on Earth. Although other flatties may disagree with me, I think that there is enough evidence to at least say that that's possible. Now, you said that flat earthers claim that the sun and moon are the same size and on the same plane. I don't know any flat earthers who claim that. I think it's safe to say that if the sun and moon are physical objects, then they are of similar size and along a similar plane. However, the relative size of the sun and moon varies. That's how you get total eclipses, that's how you get annular eclipses. So there is a bit of a variable in terms of the angular size of the sun and moon. So your question or your depiction, your caricature of flat earthers' beliefs is false. I mean, that's a running theme with globeheads, is creating straw man caricatures of the flat earth proponents' ideas and then shooting those caricatures down. But again, that's not how science is done. We don't claim that the sun and moon are of the same size. We don't claim that they are on the same planes of orbit, for lack of a better word. But I think it's safe to assume that they are of a similar size and orbiting, for lack of a better word, upon a similar plane to one another. But that doesn't mean anything. I mean, this is all very, very, very far down the line. The first thing that we have to do is measure the Earth, test it for motion, and until you can find evidence for sphericity, curvature, motion, then all of these points are 100% moot. Now, you also said, how does the moon pass in front of the sun without interacting with it? Um, we don't know. It's irrelevant. We don't know what the sun is. We don't know what the moon is. So to say that, how is this possible? How is that possible with the sun and the moon? Is it so bad to say we don't know? Because again, we're not going to just start making crap up and writing it down in textbooks, forcing it down the throats of all generations of toddlers, and then call it fact. It's not how we do it. The final thing, and I love that you asked this question, during a solar eclipse, how does the shadow of the moon cover such a small area? Well, I would love to hear your answer for that, because I already know what your answer is. You're going to bring up the whole umbra penumbra thing with this convergent pinpointer peculiar shadow angle that causes the moon's shadow to taper down into a point as it reaches the Earth. But that is not how shadows behave in reality. Now, you can take that position, but then again, that wipes out Eratosthenes' experiment that is a flagship cornerstone of the heliocentric theory, and you can't have both. Your very own theory contradicts itself by Eratosthenes' assumption that the Earth is a sphere and that the sun's rays are coming in at parallel lines to one another. That absolutely 100% contradicts the theory behind the umbra penumbra phenomenon. But see, you have to make that up from your position, because in reality we do indeed see a very teeny tiny, usually 50 to 60 mile diameter shadow of the moon during a total solar eclipse. Now, in your model, you've put yourself in checkmate, because you have to have this umbra penumbra phenomenon. Yet, again, it contradicts Eratosthenes' assumptions, which is a cornerstone of your theory. So which is it? Is the sun's rays coming towards the Earth at nearly perfect parallel angles, or are the sun's rays coming towards the Earth at convergent angles to cause this peculiar phenomenon where shadows taper off into a point as they gain distance away from the obstruction, which cannot be demonstrated in reality? Which is it? How is the shadow of the moon covering such a small area during total solar eclipses? Your model doesn't have an answer for that, yet you expect flat earthers to answer this question when we're the first ones to tell you we don't know what the sun and moon are. There's no shame in that whatsoever.
Why do the sun and moon have spherical shapes? The standard model of physics requires large gravitational forces to hold the spherical shapes of the sun and the moon. What forces keep the sun and moon in their shapes, and why do those forces not apply to the Earth?
Why do all of your questions have absolutely nothing to do with the Earth at all? Um, really. First of all, your assumption is that the sun and moon are spherical objects. If I grant that to you for argument's sake, let's say hypothetically the sun and the moon are spherical, how does that relate to the Earth itself? The answer is it doesn't. Only in your mind is there a connection between these heavenly luminaries and the physical plane which we all live on. The Earth is nothing akin to the heavenly luminaries, nothing like the sun or the moon. So even assuming that the sun and the moon are spherical objects in space, that does not make the Earth a spherical object in space, because frankly, sir, the sun and the moon are simply not the Earth.
What powers the sun? What forces are at work to keep it going? The standard model requires a large body of fuel and mass to sustain the reaction that is the sun. And there's a push-pull of gravity and kinetic forces going on at all times. All flat Earth models have a small sun. So what is powering and sustaining that sun?
Someone please cue in a snoring sound effect, because this is just so redundant. Let's start by answering the question with what you believe. You believe that the whimsical theory of hot atomic fusion is powering the sun. Now, first of all, you cannot demonstrate hot atomic fusion in reality. It is a theoretical absurdity. And then your second explanation has to do with this push and pull of gravity, which is yet another theoretical absurdity. So if it's okay for you to answer these questions in your model with just absolutely theoretical, non-demonstrable, absurd notions, we're not going to stoop to that level. Again, the best answer to this question is we do not know what powers the sun, and it is completely irrelevant to the shape of the Earth. Furthermore, just because you believe that hot atomic fusion and gravity are what powers the sun doesn't make it so. Never in a million billion years is anyone going to travel to the sun and scoop up a sample, bring that back for testing. Okay? Now, also, if hot atomic fusion could be demonstrated in reality, which it can't, there is absolutely no correlation between that and the sun. Okay? Furthermore, you say that the sun and gravity needs this large, dense mass and fuel in order to work. So now we're going to say that hydrogen and helium are large, dense conglomerations of mass, because that's what you believe it is. Some of the lightest gases known to humans are supposedly what's in the sun. This is just absolutely absurd, but that's what we're up against. As flat earthers, we're up against people who have deeply rooted belief systems in theoretical absurdities that have been taught to them their entire lives, and we're supposed to combat this absolute ignorance with the blunt answer, we don't know, yet it is irrelevant. Because again, without curvature to the Earth, without motion of the Earth, you don't even have a physical basis for your model. We don't need a model. We don't need to answer these questions. All we need to do is show that the Earth has no curvature, no motion, period, end of story. The Earth is not a spinning ball.
Why has no one gone to the other side of the Earth? What forces are at work to prevent that travel? And by forces, I mean natural forces, not conspiratorial forces.
The other side of the Earth. I'd really love to know what you mean by the other side of the Earth. And I know that I've been probably a little bit disrespectful in this video response, but I got to tell you, we've been dealing with people with your position for years now. And the problem is that you try to marry the heliocentric belief system with the flat Earth reality. And the two are just completely incompatible with one another. The flat Earth does not exist in a heliocentric universe. In fact, infinite space, as we've been brainwashed to believe in for our entire lives, for several generations, infinite space, for all as we can tell, doesn't exist. The lights in the night sky are merely lights in the night sky. We don't have to have explanations for what they are, but it is very clear that the Earth is not a disk or like a giant coin shape flying around in space. The Earth is a motionless plane, and in fact, I think it's better stated that the Earth is the motionless plane. So the Earth is the physical plane, and everything in the sky is above us. There is no other side of the Earth, as in other side of a coin. There are no forces preventing this. You simply can't travel. Let me put it to you in something you can understand. Why haven't you traveled to the center of the spherical Earth? Why haven't you gone down there? What forces are preventing you from going to the center of the spherical Earth? Well, you could say molten lava. You'd probably say gravity. I don't know. But the point is that it's quite irrelevant. But it is something that is impossible. Now, there probably is more land if you keep going, south or away from the North Pole, or just travel in a straight direction and just keep going straight for, say, 10,000 miles. There's probably more land out there. You're not going to travel off the edge of the Earth if you go in a straight line in any direction. More than likely, you're going to keep going and possibly find other quote-unquote solar systems along the plane. And by solar system, I mean, an area that has a sun and maybe a moon and stars in the sky. And, as far as we can tell, this is an electromagnetic phenomenon. Has nothing to do with the theory of hot atomic fusion. But, why haven't we traveled to the other side of the Earth? These questions are just absurd. Why haven't you traveled to the center of the Earth? Right? Why haven't you traveled to the edge of space? Because such a thing is not possible. You can't travel to the other side of the Earth that doesn't exist. I mean, you could dig for 10,000 miles and maybe run into a bunch of molten lava, but you're not going to travel over the edge and down around under the bottom of the Earth because we're not on a disk in space. That's 100% certain. And, I really hope and pray that intelligent people such as yourself are able to look at this whole phenomenon of reality objectively, scientifically, unbiased, without prejudice, and without preconceived notions, and simply practice the scientific method, which involves conducting physical experiments to either prove or disprove held beliefs, or maybe things that you don't wish to believe. But, to throw these questions out as if you have answers to them in your model, which you don't, is just absurd. So you tell me, why haven't you traveled to the center of the Earth, or what forces are preventing you from doing that? And you can clone stamp that right onto the flat Earth. So if you say it's lava, then I'll tell you lava. Okay?
And lastly, where is the definitive model of a flat Earth system? Is there an accepted model? One that encompasses the size of the Earth and the sizes, positions, and paths of the sun and the moon? Without an accepted model, flat earthers will always have an excuse to dismiss criticism. Well, that's not a true model, that's just a simplification. So I'm asking, what is the most sophisticated model you have? I understand that there are different levels of sophistication to these models. An elementary school level model of the heliocentric system is just a sun at the center of concentric circles, each with a planet sitting on it. A more sophisticated level would better represent the scale of the orbits, show orbital paths that are not circular, maybe grasp the fact that some of the orbital paths cross one another, maybe have actual values of mass and distance. And then, of course, our most sophisticated models have specific moment-to-moment orbital path data in 3 dimensions, gravitational influences, and enough data to predict the pathways of space probes. So, in your opinion, what is the most sophisticated model of a flat Earth system, and where can I find it? I look forward to seeing your answers.
Well, I suppose that question has already been answered ad nauseum in this video, but I'll go ahead and answer it one final time. The most sophisticated model of the flat Earth is, drumroll, irrelevant, because we don't need a model. All we need to do is simply measure the Earth, and astonishingly enough, we find time and time again that there is no geological curvature. Now, you can have all fancy pants models about what the heavenly luminaries are doing, apparently according to little observers here on Earth, but that doesn't make the Earth a sphere. I'll just tell you, you can track the quote unquote orbital paths of the wandering stars. And by the way, NASA is a liar and space probes don't exist, and apply that to any model. The models are based on observation and documentation, very meticulous, long-term, over the centuries, observation and documentation of what's going on in the sky. And that can be applied to any model. But, the most sophisticated flat Earth model is irrelevant. Okay, at this point in time, what we need to do is show people that there's no curvature to the Earth. It's not spinning around. And then we can allow the theoretical physicists to do their thing and start looking for answers to these questions. But, frankly, I don't even think we need to get them involved, because they've done just a terrible job up to this point, convincing themselves and then force-feeding all generations of toddlers to follow suit with their beliefs. So hopefully, if you've gleaned anything from this video, is the fact that the Earth is indeed flat and stationary. Much to our surprise, that is the case. And most importantly, we don't have to have an explanation for everything. Why is it that humankind believes that we have to have detailed explanations and models for everything when apparently, at this point in time at least, with our current technology and our current worldview being just so absurdly backwards, such a thing is not possible. So with that, guys, I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you'd like to support this channel, as I've mentioned, you can do so through Patreon to www.patreon.com/themorguile, or through PayPal to www.paypal.me/themorguile, or email me at themorguile@gmail.com. Thanks so much for your time. God bless you all. Spread the word, spread the world, and peace.